Hello and welcome back to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was Charlie Tardif, and he spoke with me today about Lake of Bays Railway, which is based in Canada. This was a subject I didn't know much about before coming onto this podcast, and by the end of it, I felt I learnt an awful lot more. So I hope you enjoy it and hope you learn about this railway as much as I did. Hello, so welcome to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history and archaeology. My name is Kaylee, and I'm here with Charlie and a previous podcaster as well, Murrey, who's also going to be on the podcast. And today we are talking about, what we're talking about today, Charlie?
The Huntsville and Lake of Bays Railway in all of its various incarnations.
Splendid. And what is it about this railway that you want us to talk about? Why do you want to share the history behind this railway?
Well, I was hoping to start with a bit of a sort of a personal story on the subject. When I was a student in secondary school, I worked at a small living history museum, and they had, the usual attractions: a schoolhouse, a farm, a blacksmith. But they also had recreated railway, so the assets of the original Huntsville and Lake of Bays Railway, recreated, running through the grounds and along the river. And I had a great time there, but I grew older and found other employment outside of the field. Eventually, left the region. And then this past winter, I had the opportunity to return. It had been about 10 years, and an old friend showed me around the site, and walked around and reminisced and all that. And then we walked into, there's a large locomotive shed. And we walked through and looked at all the various pieces of equipment. And there was a stuffed Lion King toy sitting above the window in one of the locomotives, above the cab window, this little shelf, and kind of wedge it in there. And during my first summer working there, I'd found the stuffed toy laying on top of the track. Somebody had left him. And I put him to the side, hoping an owner would retrieve him. But after a few days, he was still there. So I picked him up, stuffed him in the cab, and I guess he never left. But as we were standing there talking about it, and I was telling this story, my friend and his son were unaware of the story of the toy. They just felt it had been he'd always been part of the fabric of the place. And then it occurred to me that there have been a lot of people who've enjoyed the railway in various capacities, myself included, and not been fully aware of its story, not been fully aware of how it came to be. And I always thought it was a fascinating story, and it's one that I'm very grateful to be able to share with you both today.
That sounds fun. That's really nice. I love when there's like these little personal details that we have, especially when it comes to heritage sites, because obviously customers we don't see the behind the scenes, that sticker that they might see. It's something that a previous staff member put or whatever. It's all its stories. That I love that. That's a really cool story.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So what is it about this? So for starters, can you explain whereabouts this railway is to anybody who doesn't know?
Of course. It's in central Ontario, Canada. It's about 3 hours in a car outside of Toronto, give or take. And now it's in the big town is called Huntsville, and now it's quite a large town. It's got a hospital and a mall and this and that. But in the Victorian age, it was quite a sort of a rugged outpost on the edge of empire. And in the still now it's quite far from an international airport and things like that, but it's become more connected. And in the 1880s, a mainline railway was built through the region. And that linked it really to the wider world and spurred rapid development, starting with a lumber industry that was very much geared towards export, but then the development of farms in a town. I guess everything that followed after that. And the region remains quite beautiful, sort of rocky shorelines, many small lakes, thick forests. It's quite a popular vacation destination these days.
Sounds really nice, actually. And what is it about this railway what about the history behind the railway? What is it about this particular one that made you want to share it with us today?
I found the railway fascinating. It's a tiny railway. The longest it ever was a mile and an eighth across. It was branded for many decades as the world's smallest commercially operated railway, which is hard to prove, but it's also very plausible. A mile and an eighth isn't that far. No point did they ever have more than 2 locomotives operational. There was never a signal because if only one train was running. Well, who are you going to hit? And I found that I found that endearing. It also sort of filled a unique role in that the principal transportation network was a series of steamships. And there was this gap where the steamships couldn't operate between 2 lakes. And it's only about a mile. You're to draw a straight line between them. It's only about a mile. But the one lake's 175 feet higher than the other. And with the granite and the rock area and the layers of granite, constructing a series of locks wasn't feasible. And there would have to be some way of connecting the 2 lakes. And initially, sort of in the late Victorian era, there was an attempt to build a road across with stagecoaches. But the capacity wasn't there, and the boats would take forever to unload and reload. And then they decided to switch to the railway. And as the decades wore on, the railway went through a lot of incarnations, from being sort of a practical transportation system to being more of a tourist attraction. And then it closed, and all the equipment was relocated 5-6 hours in a car away from the region. And then a group of enthusiasts thought, okay, let's bring it back. And they couldn't bring it back quite in the same spot, so they found a way to bring it back to the Living History Museum, which is close by and also in quite a visually stunning area, and then reestablished it and reopened it as a steam railway, as a heritage attraction.
So, Charlie, you just to sort of give us a bit more historic context, you mentioned that a standard gauge railway came to the region in, I think you said, the 1880s?
Yes, it opened in 1885.
So can you, because as Kaylee says, I'm a great railway enthusiast. I have to be honest, I don't know a great deal about the history of the Canadian railway network. So can you just maybe fill in a bit more detail on that, please?
Of course. So the Canadian railway network started broadly east to west, with major population centers being linked, started in the 1830s, 1840s, and then spreading outwards from there. And very quickly, a standard gauge was adopted and sort of unified operating rules across multiple operators. And then the lines, mostly through the Victorian and Edwardian eras, lines spread out into more remote areas. There are several mineral lines that were completed in the 50s and 60s, tied to specific mining projects. Most of the networks late Victorian and Edwardian. And in the 1880s, there was a big push to connect the country east to west and complete east to west railway. And that spurred a great deal of economic development. It also spurred a lot of sort of smaller lines that either branched off or connected in some way to create a broader network. And then over the course of the 20th century, the railways consolidated into 2 principal operators, one of which was state-controlled and one of which was private. And then in the 80s and 90s, the state-controlled operator was sort of broken up. The passenger operations were separated, and then the hotels and steamships and such. And then in the 90s, it was privatized. And now the network's very broadly 2 large freight carriers operating coast to coast and into America, with intercity passenger trains operated on their tracks by a government agency, and regional trains being operated by various government agencies, mostly clustered around major cities.
Okay.
Thank you. So I know you said that you did your little personal story at the beginning to do with the teddy bear and everything, which is really adorable. But why are you interested in this railway? Why do you feel? Why do people need to know about this railway? Because you seem very enthusiastic about it.
Oh, I am. And I think it boils down, part of it's personal connection and, visiting places when you're young with grandparents and ice cream cones and all that. But mostly because there's nothing else like it in the world, right? It's wonderfully incongruous, right? So the passenger carriages are converted tram cars. And when the horse tramways in Toronto were converted to electric, they had all these old horse-drawn tram cars that were sold off. And somebody bought them and said, okay, we're going to use them, tow them behind this tiny industrial tank engine and use them to transport people between these steamboats. And even the steamboat networks are fascinating, right? Like these are Victorian and Edwardian steamships operating 1,000 miles from the ocean. And they can only operate for a relatively short season because they're in an area with, quite severe winters. It freezes up. And it's sort of it's a surprising operation started. It's surprising it lasted as long as it did. Because it was so associated with so many people with holidays, it's actually very well photographed. There are tons of postcards, there are postcards sitting in my basement that go back decades, right? Where people would come to see this attraction, come to see the lakes. Mm. And it transitioned also, like it was originally built principally to transport freight on the steamship network. There were great, huge lumber drives where they would tow logs across the lakes with tugs and booms, and in the winter they'd drag them behind these great Clydesdale horses across frozen lakes. And then as the area developed, there was quite a large hotel built that was served by the steamship network. Then it moved into more of a tourist role and moved people, but it also, into the 50s, it operated a public transit service. At the start, probably a very useful one. It beat walking. But towards the end, much, much slower than anything. By the time paved roads were in the area, it wasn't a feasible thing. And I fell in love a lot. I like the area, but also with some of the equipment. I love the little tank engines, right? They've got a great personality to them. I like the open-sided passenger cars, If the weather's good, it's rather idyllic, and if the weather's bad, it's an experience to write home about.
So can you tell us more about the engines? Because I'm sure for most railway enthusiasts, that will be the thing they most want to know about.
So there were a total of 4 engines that were operated in the commercial era. In the various preserved incarnations, gasoline and diesel-powered engines have been brought on, mostly as sort of a backup or an off-season power. And when the railway first opened, it opened in time for the 1905 navigation season after much planning and construction and such. They bought 2 tiny 040 saddle tanks. And they'd been used on an internal railway in a large pulp and paper mill. And they were sort of deemed to be at the end of their life by the pulp mill, and then were sold to the operators of the railway, which was co-owned with the steamship line. It was called Huntsville Lake-based Navigation Company, and they were built by Porter in America. I'll forget the exact tonnages, but these tiny little tank engines. They're probably smaller than my Volkswagen, and they'd have to have the pair of them running together with a full footplate crew in both, just to pull a few cars worth of lumber, or at one point there was a great deal of hemlock bark hauled on the railway, just to pull a few cars across. And these engines eventually wore out, and they were built, I think, late 1870s, early 1880s. And they were eventually wore out, and they were sold to a collector in America who kept them, and eventually the estate donated them to one of those Wild West attractions in the middle of America. And they're still there. People will go visit them in that museum. And then the railway bought 2 much more standard saddle tank engines, more substantial machines, both 42-inch track gauge, so 3'6". And they've been built by the Montreal Locomotive Works, which was a large and very well-established locomotive manufacturer, eventually closed in the 80s. And these been built for a gypsum quarry. And the use case in the quarry had been, they were large open cast mine. They were digging at the bottom, and they'd sort of push cuts of freight cars to the top to a processing facility. And they're both the 040 saddle tanks. One was a 17-tonner, one was 21. So quite small by any measure. Even though they're built in the 20s, they still had a Lincoln pin coupler where you drop in a pin. There were brakes on the locomotives, but not on the trains. You'd have a brakeman with a wheel and a chain. So fantastic things. And they brought them to Huntsville, and they floated them on a barge to get them to the railway. And they started with the heavier one, the 21 tonner, and quickly realized the track was so lightly laid, it pushed the track to the side. And nobody, I don't know whether it was a cash issue or a time issue, nobody thought to fix the track. So they just kind of parked it in a shed and used the 17 tonner, which only just didn't spread the track. And it turned out this industrial tank engine was actually a very good fit for this operation, because you're going forwards and backwards a lot, but the lines of sight were very good. It could only carry probably half a cubic yard of coal. That was fine. You're only going 1.1 miles. You could fill it up at the other end. Brilliant, easy machines to work on mechanically. Fantastically short wheelbase for narrow corners. And they looked a lot like a saddle tank you would see at many of the UK preserved railways. They've got that sort of general shape to them. And it was a very successful design for industrial use, and this turned out to be a good reuse for them. And when the Portage Railway eventually closed in 1959, a series of cost-cutting efforts hadn't worked, and it became clear that the money wasn't there. And both of these saddle tanks were sold to an individual who lived in southern Ontario. And he decided he wanted to set up a tourist attraction in a park. And he got the necessary permissions from the municipality in his town and set up this lab. And for 20 years, he would just run these 2 tank engines at a lap around this park. And I don't know what he charged. I don't think it was all that expensive. It was this great little attraction he had. And it was a passion project of an individual. It didn't actually look all that historic. It wasn't relevant to the region, but it was a passion project of an individual, and it made a lot of families happy. And then he announced in the 80s that he was selling his locomotives, and made it known that he was hoping to find them sort of a good home. And he was somebody who really cared. This wasn't somebody who was wired to make a quick buck, right? Like, this was somebody who cared, somebody who wanted to make a good home. And a group of enthusiasts in Huntsville, some of whom remembered the original railway, but I'm struck many came from sort of a diverse background, decided, okay, we want to buy them. We want to try to reestablish a railway. And I don't know exactly how he worked out the sums with them, but they worked it out and were able to buy back the steam engines. They brought them back to Huntsville. And the mayor of the day arranged this great parade. In many Canadian small towns, are all built along a single main street. And the mayor of the day arranged this great parade down the closed main street to bring them back, and all this enthusiasm. But then it became clear the enthusiasts actually had no place to run them. They knew somebody who was a farmer who had a barn, so they were outside of the elements, but there wasn't any track, right? You just had them sitting in a barn in his property. I don't know what he grew. Yeah. And then they eventually were able to build a preserved railway around that.
And is that, I'm assuming, the museum that you work at now?
Exactly, yes. Now, admittedly, the enthusiasts weren't able to make the sums quite work, so the museum they wound up joining is owned by the municipality.
Fair enough.
Well, it sounds to me like a mutually advantageous arrangement,
It is.
Yeah.
And the museum is able to advertise they've got a train and everything else. And people who come for the train ride are very likely to go check out, the blacksmith's forge, or, there's always new lamps in the spring, stuff like that. At the museum, it works together with beautiful symbiosis.
Absolutely. Well, I think, you see it in this country too. I think a lot of people don't realize just how integral railways were to rural life before the advent of the motor car. But I suppose in the area you're talking about, the fact that, it's like you say, it's a frontier region, you're largely dependent on ships rather than land-based transport. I suppose it does add a sort of an interesting extra element to that dynamic, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. And what I think a lot of people forget now is that the area was it went from being very much a frontier to quite industrial to being sort of an idyllic vacation land within about 100 years. In the Edwardian era, there was a large tannery that was co-owned with the railway. It was the biggest tannery in the entire empire in the Edwardian era. You know, millions of boots were shipped to the First World War from this tannery, and now there's no visible sign that it was ever there, right? The site's been fully cleared, redeveloped. There's no really tradition of leather goods in the area at all anymore. But an interesting chapter of history nonetheless.
So, did you say, Charlie, that the gauge of this railway was 3'6"?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, I was interested by that because my understanding was that 3 foot tended to be the more common gauge for narrow gauge railways in North America. I mean, can you just shed any more light on that?
You're quite correct. 3 foot is much more common in America, and at various points has been common in underground mining operations. But I think many of those have now switched to rubber-tired vehicles. 3'6" had sort of brief pockets of use. The biggest being in Newfoundland, where there was a railway. Newfoundland didn't join Canada until the 1940s and was administered directly by Westminster as a colony until then. And they developed a railway that was 3'6", and it was several hundred miles across. And eventually closed in the 1980s. I believe the choice of 3'6" for this railway was much more to do with the availability of tank engines from industrial concerns in that gauge, rather than a particular desire to set on that gauge. And there were a few industrial railways of that gauge. Not aware of any still operating, but several made it to the turn of the millennium. None that really left the owner's site, but sort of dense networks of sidings around large industrial plants.
Yeah, no, it's again, it's fascinating. I think it's one, industrial railways maybe sometimes get a bit overlooked by some enthusiasts. They want to concentrate on the mainline stuff, but I mean that absolutely shows, doesn't it, that the industrial networks do have an impact on the way the main, the public railways, if you like, evolve.
Oh, very much so. And it's sort of beyond the transfer of equipment, the transfer of ideas and operating practices back and forth.
Yeah.
So you said that it was used to ship logs to the different lakes. Was it used for any other things throughout its lifetime?
Yes, that's a very good question. So initially, logs and then split lumber for firewood. Like what we'd call here cordwood was very popular. And then for a period at the turn of the last century, there was a huge amount of hemlock bark shipped to the tannery. They would ship the split wood to fire a boiler, because it's not an area with any coal mines. So there's a huge incentive to use local wood to fire steam-powered equipment. And the bark of the hemlock trees would be used in the tannery. I believe they used it to remove hair, something quite, nasty and particular to that process. And then starting in the mid-1920s, the focus really shifted. And this was an initial owner of the railway died, a new owner had taken over. And he had focused very much on developing hotels. Sort of these grand resorts. And you bring in these big bands, like the Duke Ellingtons of the world would come play these sets, and he focused on that. And the only way to get to it, and he bought this island. It's this huge island, and he owned all of it. The only way to get there was on his own steamship, right? So he kind of had you. And the transport system that was set up is you take the mainline railway to the center of Huntsville. Mm-hmm. And that is now there's sort of a large railway yard in the center of town. And you'd get off at the downtown station, and you'd have a steamboat waiting for you on a jet. And the steamboat was, not a huge vessel, but a significant vessel of that era. And it would sail through a series of lakes, and they're colloquially called the lower lakes because they're all at a very similar low elevation. And they're linked by a series of canals. And he'd sail through the lakes and the canals and provide tea and narration and all that. And then he'd get to the North Portage, load everybody off the steamship onto the train, go up and over the portage, get to the Lake of Bays, which is much higher. And then he had a second steamship that would then take you for the final stop to the resort. And that's sort of the era of the railway that's most remembered, where by the 30s, a lot of the logging operations switched to trucks and tractors, and a much more mechanized approach. You saw the end of things like teams of horses in that industry. Eventually the mail started to go somewhere quicker. But to get to this resort, you still had to take the train, and it was sold as a package. And it was quite expensive. It was certainly quite a posh operation, and stunning architecturally. And that continued on into the 50s when, I guess in the late 40s, the resort and the railway parted ways commercially. There was another sale. And the resort in later decades passed through a series of owners who never could quite recreate a pre-war golden age, and eventually closed in the 60s. And the railway then started to focus on offering a tourist experience, offering a day out, with, at that point, one remaining steamship. I believe there was 8 at a peak, and then, eventually there was one. And the railway and the steamship operated this sort of excursion service into 1959, but the numbers didn't work. It was a short season. People were starting to drive around the region a lot more. It was quite slow. And really, keeping a railway open to sell tickets for 3 or 4 months a year the numbers didn't work, and that's ultimately what precipitated closure. But in early years, beyond the cordwood and the hemp park, it moved any number of things. There were families who would buy a farm up there and show up with, chickens and a milking cow, and okay, well, we got to get to the farm. And goods for general stores. Everything that went to the resorts also was brought in. Some of them had farms on site to produce some fresh produce, but all the food, linens, and it was all laboriously carted from the steamship to the train, back to the steamship.
So with the difference in levels between the two lakes, I imagine there must have been some very steep gradients on the railway.
Yes. Now, it would have been very clever of me to write down the steepest gradient. But there were several steep gradients. Broadly, the south end is much lower, the north end is much lower, the south end is much higher. But even within that, there was actually sort of an up, over, back, down. And this was handled 2 ways. Firstly, they constructed a switchback with quite a tight turning radius. And secondly, by running very short trains with these sort of stout industrial tank engines, they were able to approach the grades a bit more easily. I've never seen this written down. I also suspect not operating in the winter helped their cause somewhat. Sort of dry rails are easier to stand than, and you're not moving any snow out of the way or anything.
I mean, and as you say, if they've only got 1 or 2 working engines at any one time, I mean, that's that's a challenge for the maintenance teams, isn't it? To make sure that engine is still in fit condition to run day in, day out. I mean, it strikes me as a really remarkable achievement.
Oh, 100%. And these weren't new engines, right? Like the cores aren't easy places to operate equipment. And they'd run them intensively for their summer season. And then they would park them and come back in 6 months and try to nurse it back to life. And by
astonishing.
Young machines.
Yeah.
So what do you do with your museum? Do you said that they are still active in your museum?
I am. So maybe still's a big word. I'm back. Okay. I haven't taken 10 years off. I sort of have the honor and the privilege to serve as the vice president of the Railway Society, with the caveat that the town handles direct operations, and the Railway Society operates more in a supporting role. Most of the volunteers are members of our society. We keep a library and archive, and advocate and promote for the expansion and continued operation of the railway, while the town does, quite frankly, all the heavy lifting.
It must be because obviously, in North America, the distances between settlements are just always so much greater than here in Britain. I mean, is it a challenge, being relatively distant from other heritage railways, and sort of, are you able to get the specialist skills you need?
Yes, it's very much a challenge. We've had some workarounds that have been successful. For a lot of the steam equipment, there's a large pulp mill in the community that they make toilet paper and Kleenex and products such as that. And it's a steam-driven process. And they have a great many very, very skilled people who have all their qualifications and spent a lifetime in those trades. And several of them volunteer for us and are able to machine parts, do some of the boiler fitting and such, and that helps a great deal. The mainline railway through Huntsville is owned by Canadian National, so a large freight railway that's listed on the stock market. And at various times, and they've got a local base of sort of their maintenance forces. And at various points, they've been very generous with expertise and equipment, loans of tools, and that's helped a great deal. On the other hand, there have been times when parts have to be trucked great distances, specialists brought in from away. And I guess that's part of the operation.
Yes.
Is there any other places dedicated to this particular railroad, or is it just you guys that are dedicated to it?
I'm only aware of us dedicated to the railroad, but there's another museum about 45 minutes away in a car that's devoted to the steamship industry. And they have the last steam-powered Royal Mail ship anywhere in the world.
Oh, wow.
And they run it. And so, while they're not devoted to the railway, it's certainly a common interest and a common purpose, and they do a fantastic job. They're a world-class attraction.
And do you do fancy attractions where you get all the locomotives out as well? Because Murrey has recently been to something like that very recently, so I'm just wondering if it's something that happens in your area as well, where you have like a festival or something where you showcase them all.
Yes, there are a couple of different festivals. There's much less transfer equipment. I'm not aware of another preserved 3-foot 6-inch gauge railway in the area. So we're limited in what we can do in terms of bringing in equipment from other lines. But there are open days when all the equipment's brought out, sort of lined up against the platforms, very typical, so you can see. There's a long-running project to bring a second locomotive back into steam. I don't want to speculate as to when or if it'll ever get finished, but it's brought out in its sort of disassembled state to show, okay, this is how it works, and this is why we're trying to bring it together. There's also a diesel shunter that was brought in. It's not original to the area, but it's necessary to continue to operate this sort of service, and it's brought out. So those days are done quite frequently. And it used to be that sort of peaked in the middle of the summer, but now with an increased focus on fall colors, the sort of peak of the season and the peak of the enthusiast calendar is now migrating into September and October.
And then I suppose you must do maintenance over the winter.
Well, that's always been the tricky bit. So yes, maintenance is done, as much as done either early in the spring or late in the fall. But there is a fully enclosed, there's a shed, but there's also a machine shop in there. Track maintenance is difficult to do with the frost in the ground.
I can imagine, yeah.
The current operating season is May to October.
Okay.
Which allows some flexibility on the shoulder seasons without having to go do too much in the coldest months of the year.
Yeah.
There's now a Santa train, which is fantastic. It's great fun. It's superbly popular, but it's for the first time in the railway's history now actually has to operate in the cold.
Yes, I mean, I had, yes, I've volunteered on heritage railways over the years, and there's probably pictures out there somewhere of me dressed as a Santa elf. I think that was the first job I ever did on any heritage railway, was being Santa's helper at Christmas time. So you're quite right. I mean, they're good money spinners, but also they create a lovely atmosphere, don't they? And they're a good way to engage, a family audience who may not be enthusiasts with with a wonderful heritage railway, which that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's getting new blood in.
100%, and it's brought in a lot of young people who then, have worked for the town or volunteered in various capacities, and that's wonderful, right? Like to be able to see people. I'm older now. I live about 90 minutes away from the railway in a car, but it's wonderful to see people I knew as kids now doing my old job. Right, it's a great thing.
Yeah,
that's all that.
Yeah, I must say it is. I'm assuming it's a steam engine, the train.
It is.
Yeah. So like over here, one of the novelties we do is there's a place called Keighley and Haworth near me, which is like a little village up in the moors, but they do a 1940s weekend, and that's when they bring out the locomotive and do it all 40s style, and they go on the steam train. So I bet it must be nice to be able to, just a novelty of being able to be on a locomotive like that.
Of course, and great deal of attention to detail is paid not only on the train itself, but to stations and associated facilities to sort of sell a scene.
Well, thank you for this. This has been really interesting. I've been introduced to a new railway sort of thing. Is there anything else you want to say about the railway? And is there anything you want to say, Murray, as well?
Oh, you first, Charlie, because this is very much your subject.
Well, I appreciate it. So I've got a couple of things to say. Firstly, if anybody listening is at all interested in coming out to experience the railway, or even in volunteering, please reach out. You can contact me directly, or get in touch with Muskoka Heritage Place. They're on all the social networks. They've got a good website, very prompt and email responses. The current operating season is May to October, Tuesday to Saturday. Steam's generally only in the summer months, maybe some dates in the fall, year to year. The view is of the Muskoka River, which is the same route the steamboats plied all those years ago.
That's wonderful. I'll make sure to link everything down below in the pod description. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I just want to say thank you for introducing me to a railway that I'd never heard of, and which in all honesty, I don't think is particularly well known on this side of the pond, but maybe it should be, because as you say, it sounds like it's something really unique, and just because it's small doesn't mean that it's not interesting and not, I mean, it's a shame, obviously I can't see the pictures of it, while I'm talking to you now, but you've made it sound delightful, and it's a long way to go, but hopefully one day I shall make it to Canada, but we'll see.
Well, and when you do reach out, it's also all over YouTube, which might be a bit of a lower cost commitment.
Yes.
Oh, well, this has been really wonderful. Thank you so much, Charlie, for coming onto this podcast and for sharing this very fascinating piece of history, a little glimpse into another country's history as well. It's been really, really rewarding. So thank you so much for that.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you both. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. If you enjoyed today's episode and feel that you would also like to appear on the podcast, please do not hesitate to get in touch. You can either message me down below in the comments, or you can message me over on my Instagram, which is Book and Trowel. Please just let me know your name, your topic of interest, and I will be in touch. I hope to talk to you soon, and thank you for listening to today's episode.